This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty.
And I'm Gianna Sino. I'm tonight's co-host, and this is episode number 121.
This evening, we're going to explore learning in the 21st century. The term 21st century skills is generally used to refer to certain core competencies such as collaboration, digital literacy, critical thinking, and problem solving that advocates believe schools need to teach in order to help students thrive in today's world.
In a broader sense, however, the idea of what learning in the 21st century should look like is open to interpretation and potential controversy. Tonight, we are going to explore what continues 21st century learning and propose ways we can approach learning for now and for the future.
We've got a lot to talk about, and we have an amazing panel to explore these topics with. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to read each of our panelists' bios, but we do want to remind our audience that you can find out more about each of our participants on the show notes page located at fortheloveoflearningshow.com, and look for the show notes page for episode number 121. There you will find more information about each of our panelists and links to their projects and websites.
So today's first guest is Bridget. Bridget has been engaged in social change theory since her teenage years in Germany. She's been committed to bringing awareness to patriarchal domination patterns and misogynistic attitudes in her personal and professional life. As a mother, she realizes her responsibility to transform these patterns so that future generations do not need to repeat the destructive path of the past, but will be able to practice the collaborative skills needed. Bridget left her career as a clinical and research psychologist in Germany over 20 years ago. She has continued to work as a family and couple therapist in Australia, but in the last 10 years has shifted her focus to creating spaces for conversation in the community and educational organizations. As a parent who chose motherhood consciously later in life and who enjoys the ongoing co-learning journey with her son, she believes that the paradigm shift we need to be a parent time shift, and that the future of education is not education, but mutual learning. Welcome to tonight's panel, Bridget.
Hello, it's wonderful to be here, and it's exciting. It's the first to be together with my son in a public online conversation.
Wow, we're super excited to have both of you. And actually, we're going to introduce your son next. So next, I'm going to introduce Luke. Luke is a 16-year-old student and musician who currently attends an innovative public school in Melbourne, Australia. Luke's primary passion has been music. He began playing classical guitar at an early age, and more recently has also begun singing and composing and performing his own music. He also teaches guitar and performs regularly with several independent ensembles. Luke has attended several schools around Australia and has had experiences of many different forms of schooling, including from within the public system, Steiner schools, and parent-run co-op community school. Luke believes that mainstream education does not equip young people with the skills needed to thrive in a time of a global environmental crisis and social polarization. Driven by this awareness, Luke, together with his parents, is exploring alternatives to attending a school that creates opportunities for passion-driven collaboration rather than individual achievement and standardized competition. Welcome to tonight's panel, Luke.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here.
Next, I'd like to welcome Yayo. Yayo was born and raised in Mexico City. He moved to Oaxaca in 1997 to support and learn from indigenous communities. Through his work in the nonprofit sector, Yayo has developed a deep respect for the capacity people have to make a good life for themselves when they're able to freely take responsibility for their own communities. In 2010, Yayo was part of the pioneering team of the Art of Hosting Meaningful Conversations in Spanish, and has hosted and organized multiple intercultural encounters around the world using these tools for dialogue. Yayo is a fierce spiritual warrior who stands for peace and for the rights and capacities of people everywhere. Currently, he is focusing his efforts on encouraging people to take responsibility for their own garbage, promote and support alternatives for real learning, community communication experiments around the world, and gift culture practices, helping people to recover the capacity to create the future they want to live in. He considers himself a perpetual learner and tries to stay present for new opportunities of learning. Welcome to tonight's conversation, Yayo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Very happy to be here again.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you too. And finally, I'd like to introduce David to tonight's panel. I'd like to welcome him. David is the founding president of Self-Design Graduate Institute, a low residency and online graduate school engaging learners in North and South America, Europe, Asia, and New Zealand in a learning community of care, selfdesigninstitute.org. David is the author of Evolutionary Parenting and The Common Vision, Parenting and Educating for Wholeness. These books describe the evolutionary insights of Sri Aurobindo, and I think you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of that, Rudolf Steiner, and Hazrat Inayat Khan in regard to the unfoldment of children and teens from birth to age 21. According to these three teachers, the future of our species depends on our capacity to parent and educate our young in ways that promote the evolution of consciousness and nurture the unfoldment of each individual's potential. Welcome to tonight's panel, David, and please correct me if I mispronounced your teachers' names.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and close enough, so don't worry about it. So I'm happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you, and everybody on the panel has been involved in a conversation on our show over the past 3 years at some point. So it's such an honor to get together this beautiful group of people to have this conversation. So I'm going to start with you, David. What skills are needed for 21st century learning? What exactly does 21st century require from us as learners and as, dare I use the word, educators?
So that's a question I've engaged with, probably for 30 years now. And so there are a couple things I would say about it. One interesting element in the list of skills that you offered, Lainey, in your introduction of the topic, which is pretty much commonly out there in the literature and has been for 25 years, is that you could pretty much find all of that in John Dewey's talk about what education ought to be in 1905. And the piece that's missing that Dewey brought to that was the notion also of democratic institutions in addition to those skills. So often when educators and or capitalists talk about those skills, they leave out the democratic institution part. Secondly, I would say that it's really not that difficult for young people to learn those skills if they are allowed to experience them in learning environments and communities in their lives and called upon to use those skills and develop them over a period of time. I've seen 6-year-olds in democratic schools engage in very complex democratic, bargaining and democratic activities and, lobbying their 18-year-old colleagues and so on and so forth. So it's not that we don't know how people learn those skills. It's that we don't allow children to learn them in most schooling, and certainly adolescents as well. And the third thing I would say is that, so what do we know about the 21st century? And I would say we don't know very much. We really don't know very much. But we do know a couple of things from my point of view. One thing is that we know that there is a significant effort to rapidly develop new technologies that will likely transform the life of human beings and of other life forms on the planet. And that these technologies are being developed primarily by men who have very limited consciousness. And this is a problem in the sense that it excludes most of the 7 billion people on the planet from what's happening to us. It's our lives that are being transformed, and yet nobody's asking the vast majority of us whether we want to have artificial intelligence take over our lives. Do you really want to have your appliances talk to each other online so that some company somewhere can know what you're doing 24 hours a day? So this is an incredibly powerful phenomenon that is, I would argue, out of control. And I would even go a little bit further and say that there's a quality of cancer to this, in the sense, as a metaphor, that it's out of control and there's growth for the sake of growth. So given that, what I would say the most important qualities for education in the 21st century is really to nurture the evolution of consciousness in every individual who has access to that. Because if we have adults who have expanded consciousness, who are able to engage in complex judgments, who are able to integrate mind and heart and body and soul, and who have access to society's power, we're going to have a really different kind of world than we have right now.
You know, I'm so glad that we're starting this conversation off with consciousness as the first driving topic. And I'm really glad that we didn't just jump into 21st century technology as the most important thing. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I want to ask you, David, in your opinion, are there, outside of, say, the democratic school system, Sudbury or Summerhill kind of schools, are there opportunities to gain that kind of experience or practice other than those institutions that I just mentioned? Can we develop the ability to understand how to collaborate, how to negotiate, how to form consensus without having a system in place that supports that?
Well, there are individual schools and learning communities and learning cooperatives and all kinds of grassroots programs for children and teens all over the planet. And I wouldn't begin to say that I know where they all are, but I've through my experience of having learners in my program in Brazil, for example, there's a free school movement in Brazil. I hear about schools in Israel. I hear about schools in Russia even. And so clearly there is an incipient movement, but the movement itself is dependent on consciousness. And one of the things about schooling is that because the money for schooling is largely controlled by governments, governments are reactionary by and large. And it makes it really difficult to move the system when you have reactionary governments who control the money. And yet, if you need to come up with money privately, then it limits access only to the wealthy who can afford a Waldorf school or can afford a Montessori school or can afford a parent co-op school. So I don't know. It's a really difficult question. There have been waves of movement, and each wave of movement has been kind of pushed back by reactionary social forces in the various societies. But one of the things that we've learned is that change is not linear. Change is unpredictable, and so it's not at all clear what is the tipping point I believe that there is a tipping point, and I believe that we absolutely need to get there. But what it is, I have no idea.
Yeah, again, thank you for that. And I can't even tell you how thrilled I am to hear you say that, because like I have conversations with teenagers all the time about the potentiality of what I call utopia, right? But in my mind, it could only happen if consciousness shifts. It could only happen, we cannot impose it in my mind from the top down through a system. And so I really appreciate this as the leading
If we have a moment later, I have something about teenagers, adolescents I really like to share in this context, but I really want to let my colleagues talk at this point.
Awesome. Thank you.
So Yayo, we would like to ask you what you think are the skills needed to be a 21st century learner.
Well, I have to say that I started the 21st century with a learning project, Universidad de la Tierra, that is the project that probably bring me here. It started as an anti-school learning movement. And what we were trying to do was recovering people's capacity for self-learning. So I will say that for me, an absolute indispensable needed tool is to know how to learn, to relearn how to learn, and to recover our autonomous capacity to find the knowledge we need to, and know why we need that knowledge and how we're going to apply it. I think that more and more school systems starting to recognize their failure. Like almost 20 years ago when we started this project, everybody looked at us as the crazy people in the world. Like UNESCO was saying literacy for everyone, and we were saying no, like school doesn't work. And I have to say, David, I feel that we are advancing so quickly on that, because as I saying, 20 years ago, there was no one taking us seriously when we said we want to have a learning center, not a school. And now, like all the time, people from formal universities and high school come to us trying to relearn how to learn, and include in their programs more and more self-directed learning processes. So I'm pretty optimist on that field, because I think that now that we know that having a degree is not assuring us the good life or have a nice job or get famous into history, then people start seeing what was impossible to see before, like what is the real function of schools in the modern system. And it's basically nurseries for the kids. We don't know what to do with our youngest, so we send them to school and somebody will take care of them there. And it also trains us to follow the rules. More than that, I think that it's more an obstacle for real learning than, and that's the real purpose of education, just train us to be part of the mainstream.
And do you believe that people can attain these skills through school?
I think that people could address this thing through school, because I think that it's absolutely necessary to have a community around you to get these skills. Like learning in isolation is not impossible. I know a lot of people that are doing it, especially young people right now, because community is getting dissolved all around the world. And reforming, but at the same time, so school could be that community for you. The question will be, are schools ready to let go control and the power to define what you need to learn and when, and be assistance in your learning process instead?
Before we move on, Yayo, you talked about community as an important aspect. Can you talk a little bit about what constitutes social learning and community, and how that supports, again, I'm not sure if I want to call it soft skills, but the ability to learn. How does social learning actually work in your mind in an optimal way?
Well, learning in society is happening all the time. We'll learn from our parents' manners to go around, but we also learn certain skills by seeing the neighbor doing it, and then sometimes we even ask them to teach us how to do it. And so I do feel that that it's absolutely necessary for, in my perspective, to really have focused learning into something you want to do. And normally you jump into, sometimes you do things because you want them, but even those ones have a social link. You do the biggest purpose of learning something is to serve your surroundings, the environment you are around it, social or natural, because I also think that when I talk about community, and that is something I have learned for many years living here in the most indigenous state of Mexico, is that community is not only the persons around you. Community is the trees that are familiar in your everyday walking and feed us. And community is the animals, the wild ones and the ones that we had domesticated, that also part of the community that hold you and accompany in that in your learning adventures.
Wow, that's beautiful. I hope that we talk about the ecosystem of learning. I mean, I think that's what I hear you saying, that ecosystem of all of it and all the interconnectedness, which also ties back into the consciousness of learning that David was talking about. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to Luke. Luke, you are seen on the panel, and I'd love to know what you feel are the most important skills needed for 21st century learning. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the experiences you've had that work and the ones that have.
I lost you there for a moment. Would you say the second part of the question?
Sure. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the experiences that you've had that actually have worked and the ones that haven't worked.
Sure. Yeah, so as you said earlier, I've been to a few different kinds of schools, Steiner schools, parent-run schools, and now I'm at a state school. And I can remember really enjoying, because I was at a Steiner school for a lot of my primary school, and I absolutely really enjoyed the artistic focus. That was something I was very much drawn to anyway. But also the sort of the close-knit community and nurturing atmosphere that those schools provided. So as I was a young kid, I really sort of benefited from that and was able to develop really close relationships with my peers and with the teachers as well. But as I came into high school, I found that there's sort of very much a predetermined, like, linear progression of what you study at a certain time, and what is a very set idea of what a child is at each stage of their development and what a teen is. And yeah, I found that sort of the way the philosophy played out in the curriculum in the senior years was a bit limiting, in terms of it didn't allow you to follow your own curiosity much. So I have now for 2 years been at what is a government school, but it's quite an innovative school in that there are no real year levels, in that students of any age within the school can study whatever subjects they're interested in at the level of experience that that they're at. So that's something that's really great about that school. And there are a lot of really wonderful teachers who are incredibly supportive. I'm a musician, so I can use the example of having professional musicians as my teachers and collaborators. We've performed together, and they're very supportive of projects that the students want to run themselves in terms of offering their own expertise and their time. So yeah, I've really appreciated having really passionate and experienced people around me. So I love what my school provides for that, especially with the music. But what I would feel in general is missing would be the skills of being able to stay in conversation and really listening. There's a lot about sort of being able to speak and being able to be out there or be an entrepreneur or having sort of a clarity in what your message is and what you want to do, make your mark, but really the skills to sort of the practice of staying in conversation and listening is what I feel is missing in sort of a time when we have to, there's all these challenges that we're going to have to negotiate. And yeah, I think the ability to listen is really what's missing.
Now, you grew up in Australia?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering that because I don't actually know how similar the school system is from America and then in Australia. I just know that you guys are a lot more progressive than us. And I have a lot of people around my age and, you know, going through high school and stuff as well, where they'll be like, they always talk about how they wish they'd gone through the school system in Australia instead. It's a talking point for sure. And I was just wondering if you had any opinions on that.
Yeah, okay. I haven't gone to school in any other country, but the only other government school that I've been to was a very small school in the bush. There were about 18 or 24 kids when I left in the whole school. 2 teachers. It was a beautiful little school in the middle of the bush. So I probably haven't got the most experience of what a conventional Australian school would be.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
But bush.
It's Australian.
So forest. Sorry. So that would be the word we would use for being out in the forest. In the country. Yeah. Apologies. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Well, what you're describing is what I would imagine 21st century skills are necessary, meaning entrepreneurship, the ability to advocate for yourself, the ability to do things that are passion driven. So it sounds to me like some of those things are being met, but some are not.
Certainly in terms of trying to foster like independence and absolutely self-advocacy, I think is and will be very important, but it's just that what I feel is missing, especially if we think about the sort of development of technology, which is another part of this topic. The skills of listening and staying in conversation when we do come into conflict, or when our ideas or our needs come into conflict, that I don't think there's a space where that's being practiced so much in schools. So yeah, I've sort of certainly observed a lot of kind of social isolation within my sort of peer group at school. And I feel like if there were a place where people could really, where there was a practice of listening to each other, that would be a really wonderful practice. going into the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insight. And I'm really glad that you're a part of the panel and the conversation today as well, or for you this morning, for us this evening.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And why don't we talk to Bridget? Bridget, you've been sitting next to your son, listening to him speak, and I'm sure that you can speak from the perspective of the work that you do, but also from the position of a mother who's helping empower a young learner and who seems to be very, very incredibly articulate and self-aware. What do you think is necessary? What skills are necessary from your perspective and both perspectives, educator, somebody who works in, with families and communities, but also from the perspective of being a parent?
Yeah. Look, I think when we talk about 21st century education, and as David said, we really don't know very much. It's, we actually dealing with this unpredictability and uncertainty. And I think what Luke mentioned in the school, maybe there is sort of a bit too much certainty taught, and too much go out, you can do it, when actually we don't know what and where and when. So I think, what the focus at this time needs really to be on ecological consciousness, on environment. And environment I see is not out there. Actually, we are the environment, and you are my environment, I am yours. So, what's missing is that relational intelligence, the conversational intelligence. And I think Luke was pointing at that. We have a lot of conversations around it at home also about this. There's great opportunity at that school, or in schools, but I guess my heart is in unschooling, but Luke's finding resources at schools, which he wants and needs. And because we are in this situation on the planet we're in, with this really dangerous development where people, just lose their capacity to make choices, where their attention is hijacked. If we talk about evolution of consciousness, we have to look at what's happening to our attention, because only if we can focus our attention, we can evolve. And I think that's what's at stake at the moment. And if we're not focusing in our education on practicing ways of, I guess, nurturing that focus of attention and the choice we make on what we want to focus, and not having that hijacked by technology. I think that's sort of my focus, I would say, because education in a way is about designing the social fabric of society, and that links to mental health and so on. So I guess mainly, my background is psychology, but mainly I speak really as a mother and my concern for future generations and the planet.
And the planet. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I everybody sort of hinted on this, and I really want to talk about the ecology. Like, what is the system that we're all serving? And ecology means the environment, the universe that we're talking about, the system itself. And in school, traditionally, we've separated all of the ideas, so things didn't have that connection, that point of connection. And I think all of us are talking about going back to seeing how things are interrelated through social consciousness, through evolution, through psychology even, and through self-awareness and being a part of a system. I don't know exactly where this question is going, but I know there's something in there. I know there's something. There's a morsel that that needs to come out. Something. Anybody want to take it from there? I know.
Yeah, I think maybe it sort of links back to what David mentioned in the beginning about the environment. Where does education take place? You know, and the missing, you know, part was the democratic institutions, that we actually need to be free to learn in a way. And I think, like Luke said, we have been involved in many different schooling systems, but what was missing there was also this, say, a systemic understanding. You know, the focus is on learning content and a certain curriculum, but you know, we haven't made that shift to understand that the environment matters, how much the environment matters for learning, and not the content, the information. So we have separated information from energy, and information and energy, you know, they travel together. But and energy is, I guess, our energy in motion and our relationships. We have missed that the relational context is more important for learning than the content. Okay, so maybe that's where it goes.
I really want to jump here because I think that Bridget just mentioned two things that are crucial for me here. First of all, is what are the conditions that we're creating for people to learn, right? Is the like being competitive and trying to get the best grade and feel overwhelmed because you have to pass exam the best environment for learning and to support people inquiries. But the other one, and it has to do with something that David said previously at the beginning of this show, is we have been trained in schools for a long time to live our life as is the system that we live in. It's a machine, predictable, that we could control. And then if I move this machine here, or if I push this button, I know what is the results that I'm going to get. But life and human beings and human societies are not predictable like that. We cannot know what the future looks like. So it's pretentious and stupid to think that I know now what a kid will need to know in 20 years from now or in 15 years from now. But the ability that we are imagining out of our younger generations is the ability to be able to react to what is emerging, to actually go through life with surprise and ready to know something that you cannot even imagine that it exists before, because that's more and more what is evident, that the world is evolving there. And with all these changes that we're doing around us as humans, that emergence and that rapid, quickly change is more and more in the next block. It's happening so fast that I think that we need to teach ourselves and others how to be able to be prepared for the emergence, to whatever wants to flourish, and then follow through it with curiosity and a real inquiry to try to know, how could I relate with this, and how does this relate with me and my whole environment? And that will also slow down the terrible ecological damage we are doing right now. If we just take the time to stop for a moment and think, what are the consequences of developing this or that new technology will have, not only to me and my human peers, but to the whole environment that we are depending on each other to survive.
And thank you. I love the way that you stated that. So I want to just add something to that, if I may, and that is that we've created a focal point for Homo sapiens, and actually for every other species as well. And that is that we've become so powerful that we're changing the climate. So you could look at this as a disaster, which it is or will be increasingly, but it's also an evolutionary challenge for our species in that it's very democratic because it affects everybody. And, you know, maybe there's some billionaires that think they can go off somewhere and escape, but everybody else, you know, ultimately they can't escape either. So, you know, we have a responsibility, I would argue, which, you know, says that, you know, one of our primary, if not our primary focus in education of our young is to prepare them and engage them in dealing with this evolutionary crisis that we've created on the planet. And that would be a really good context for learning. You could learn every skill you wanted to in that context. Every academic skill, every subject, you know, every interpersonal skill, the capacity to listen, history, you know, nations like the United States, which are far more responsible for this than many, many other nations, you know, we would have to learn about responsibility as a nation. That would be a good thing for us to learn. And for helping, you know, societies that are less able to respond to it. So there's a whole, you know, I mean, to use a metaphor, you know, if I was walking on the street and a car hit me, I would be really focused on what just happened, which is that I needed to get healthy again. So it's not all that different. You know, we're on a planet, we've constructed a climate disaster, and we could still do something about it.
Except we're on our smartphone and don't realize that we're hit by a car.
Well, I think though, if we invited,
that
I was just going to say, if we invited young people, you know, I meet young people all the time who get it, you know, all the time, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 20-year-olds who get it. They may be on their smartphones too, but they get it. They get what's happening and they want to do something about it. Go ahead.
Yeah, the thought that I had is it seems to me or it occurs to me that within an education system, the system itself, the traditional system, the conventional system, at least in the U.S., in other you know, developed nations, the subjects are so separated out and conceptual, and they're not meaningful in the sense where they're not actually applied in any meaningful way. It's a conceptual discussion about astronomy or a conceptual discussion about the cells. It's a conceptual discussion about the small parts, and we don't see through the traditional education system the interrelation between all of the things that we're meant to learn. The focus is on the content or the curriculum rather than on how it all relates. How do we fix that?
Well, I think it have to start with what Bridget was saying. Like, we need to shift our lenses and start having a systemic point of view. We need to start approaching things not by the isolated item it could be, but how does it impact in the system and how it relates to the whole system at the same time. And I think that here you said traditional education, and I will correct a little and say traditional modern education, because in traditional societies this learning is integrated. You know, like, people do not study how to grow potatoes and not know how to grow corn. Like, people learn agriculture not only as in fact, not only as learning how to grow a plant, but in a way that it includes how growing that plant would affect the soil, would use the water resources, will affect the rest of the animals around. So I think that I would love, Bridget, if you could like develop more of what you were saying. But when you say that the world systemic, system thinking, that's what I think will be the most important shift we need to do in education if we want to continue like privileging school systems for people to go and learn. Then definitely we need that shift in order to make much more meaningful our learning and actually useful for the challenge that life is putting in front of us as a species.
Yeah, maybe if I go into that, go back a little bit further with education, saying it doesn't actually start with school or school-aged children, and we talked about, the role of the environment. And so I really say, let's start from the beginning and let's say, what is our first learning environment? It's actually our mother's womb. So this is the most neglected part. This is blind spot that perinatal time is actually so crucial for the rest of the life. And we don't pay attention. We really don't pay attention in what mothers and young families need at that time. So say this is again the neglect of the relational and systemic thinking there, because say the creativity and the social fabric and the future of life really depends on how we nurture and care for life from the beginning on. So and that is a learning. I learned that actually with this my 21st century learning, how living systems host each other. While the mother makes the baby makes the mother. It's actually really an interaction. It's not a thing, a separate thing. So that's kind of something we have to shift. Now, how to get there? I really think we have to pay attention to the tiny little things, not the big. That's why I'm critical of that, what Luke also mentioned at his school, sort of being out there, being the entrepreneur. It's all that out there. It's actually really shifting the lens to seeing the small or the invisible even, that because, in the womb, you don't see the baby, but there's a lot of life happening there and a lot of crucial development and education, not education, but learning happening, mutual learning happening. So I guess to be a parent, to be a mother, actually, I learned that from my child, not from somewhere else. So anyway, that I just bringing the focus on that small little things. I do that in small, hosting small conversations and practicing at home, and really. So I think Luke mentioned the listening, because that's kind of a very crucial point in our life.
And I think that I think you just brought up a very powerful point, that the adults that are interested in having their children, quote unquote, educated, need to take the responsibility for facilitating a learning environment where they are empowered and they do feel autonomous and they do have some control over that. But if we're talking about going up against a system that is already in place, that's archaic, that may not be serving the greater good of humanity, what do we do? What do we do as parents and as educators? What do we do? Anybody want to take that?
Just quickly say, I think it's terribly hard, but I cannot do it without a practice of self-compassion, with all the resistance you get, with all the fear reactions you get. So I think with that, if we know about that systemic view and experience, then we will feel alone at times very much, and I guess a lot of have a lot of misunderstanding also. I think without a continuous practice of self-compassion, couldn't do it. So I think that's part of the job.
So I can speak briefly to that question. Do we have time? So I spent about 25 years of my life trying to make things different in public schools in the United States. And I don't think it's possible. I worked at it, not me alone. Many people worked at it. And although I would have resisted this, at a younger age, I think Buckminster Fuller was right when he said, don't try to fix the existing failed institution, create something new. And I think that's absolutely right. So I think that people need to be willing to create something new, and they need to be dedicated to themselves and to their children. And often there's sacrifices involved. I know as a parent, I sacrificed at times so that my stepdaughter could be in an independent school. I mean, it wasn't a life-changing sacrifice, but there was some quality of that. But I don't see, and I could be completely wrong, and there could be a revolution in public schooling, next year. But I think it's unlikely because public schooling brings together these reactionary forces. And ironically, I mean, in the United States, the rigidity in public schooling in terms of limiting consciousness is actually greater than in the military, which is pretty bizarre. I mean, you find more consciousness in the military than you do in what's acceptable, not in individuals. There are many individuals in public schooling, who are very evolved in consciousness, and and they're split. And Parker Palmer wrote a couple of good books about this, where he talked about split, divided no more. But the reality is that many public school teachers are divided because they're in the United States, and I imagine this is true elsewhere, because they have to conform to a certain set of expectations in the school, but when they're allowed to in their own lives, they're actually very different people.
I just want to share here before we break. The Zapatista, that is an indigenous social movement down here in Mexico, have this phrase that I think that will summarize this issue. They said, we made a revolution because we try to change the world. But we realize that changing this world is very difficult, maybe impossible. So what we're doing now is building a new world, a world that could fit many worlds.
That's absolutely beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And with that, we are going to take a short, I think it's about a 4 or 5 minute break, and we will continue the conversation after this.
Probably the most important thing for kids growing up today is the love of embracing change. I mean, the catch for preparing students for the 21st century workforce is how do you get kids that have curiosity and a questioning disposition? We've called it in the past the gaming disposition. Is that if you look at the disposition of hardcore gamers, such as World of Warcraft, mouse and multiplayer games, the surprising things you find, contrary to what people think, is these kids, first of all, are incredibly bottom line oriented. They want to be measured because they want to see how much they're improving. And in fact, the most common mantra of a real gamer is, if I ain't learning, it ain't fun.
I don't think any kid is born digitally native. I think kids are born consuming media, but I don't think kids are born producing media. So almost any kid that you look at and you say, oh wow, this is a great user of digital media, you can trace back. There's a parent, there's a program, there's something that inspired them and developed them.
You know, part of the opportunity here is learning the content, which is very much the 20th century idea around education. But in the 21st century, it's learning the tools and the skills of remaking that content and becoming the creator and the producer.
We know that the learning outside of school matters tremendously for the learning in school. So a lot of what we're trying to say about kids in formal learning with new media is part of an already existing set of understandings that educators have of the importance of the home environment, for the peer environment, for the community, for learning that happens in schools. The question is, how can we be more active about linking those two together?
We just assumed when we opened the school that digital media would be available at all moments. And we have a technology philosophy around bring it out when we need it and put it away when we don't need it. We have a wireless building, the kids use laptops, and the reason we do that is so that we can put them away when it's actually not the best tool for them to be learning with.
We find when we talk about 21st century skills, people often reduce them to skills for the workplace and skills involving technology, and we really are thinking about skills for creativity, for civic engagement, for social life, the full range of experiences that young people will be involved in the future.
I think for teachers and schools and classroom learning, there's still an incredibly important role to play, which is about giving kids access across the board to a baseline set of standards, literacies, expectations about what they need to participate in contemporary society, to be reflective, and to also take opportunity of the fact that you really have kids and adults in a shared space that's safe, that's sanctioned, that gives kids an opportunity to reflect on things in their everyday life that's not just about them being immersed in it all the time. So I think that there are incredibly important functions for schools. What we're saying by valuing informal learning is not that we should abandon formal learning, but that we should get those working together in a much more coordinated way.
So we hope you enjoyed that video. The video sort of aligned a little bit with the first hour of this conversation, although it talked a little bit more about the technological development. And I think I want to focus a little bit about the adolescent development, and because adolescents are near the end of their education before they go into the adult world. And I think it's really important to talk about and explore the kind of education that they're getting, and also in terms of, how are we preparing teens to step into the world? What kind of preparation are they getting? I want to hand the floor over to David. Let's hear from you first.
Okay, thank you. So Homo sapiens, our species, has been around for about 200,000 years. And Cro-Magnon, who is really the first modern Homo sapiens, is maybe 40,000, 45,000 years. We got bigger frontal lobes, which are associated with all these wonderful things that human beings like to do and develop and build and create and all those good things. So up until 114 years ago, the word adolescence didn't exist. It was coined in 1904. And so basically for 190,000 years, Homo sapiens, there were no adolescents. I mean, there were teenagers, but in every society, those people were adults. You know, they took on adult lives. They became sexual a little bit older than we do, but they took on adult roles. And you know, in many societies, there were rites of passage. You would go from being a child, you have a rite of passage, and then you'd be an adult. So, but this notion of adolescence only evolved when industrial society provided enough abundance that we didn't need to send these people out to work. So even then, 100 years ago, 114 years ago, there weren't millions of adolescents until the 1960s. So we're really talking about, 60 years out of 200,000. So it's not surprising that we don't understand adolescence as cultures. So, you know, I'll give us a break. We're not completely stupid. But basically, what happened was the only institution in the 19th century in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany and France, the countries that evolved public education was that dealt with people that age was the high school. And the high school was only attended by a very, very tiny fraction of boys who were either going to become clergy or who came from the ruling class. Nobody else went to high school in the 19th century. But as we began to move these people out of the workplace, and of course, every couple of decades, there was another scare about, oh, these teenagers are going to kill everybody. You know, you can see this. One of the funniest, if you watch the movie The Blackboard Jungle, which is 1955, if you've never seen it, it was about the teenagers who were chewing gum and destroying the world. I kid you not, you know. And so what happened was that over a period of 60 years, we decided, well, we got to put these people somewhere. Let's put them in high school. And, you know, the high school is a disaster for many, many teenagers. And even for the teenagers who make it work for themselves, and there's a fraction who do that, a portion who do that, it's a limitation on who they could be as people. And what we know about adolescents is that adolescents develop intellectual skills, they develop vision, they develop creativity, they develop passions, and we want to restrict their passions. You know, we're scared of their passions. They develop vision for the future. And even worse, they look around at the world and they say, wow, things are pretty screwed up. And you did this. They say this to their parents and teachers. And we have a hard time listening to this. So Margaret Mead, who is one of the wisest people that I know in the 20th century, actually wrote about this in the early 1970s because she was looking at what was going on in the 1960s. And she was one of the few, you know, elders who got this. And she said, well, it's not surprising that adolescents are rebelling, which was happening all over the world, by the way, not just in the United States or Canada. It happened in Mexico, and in Mexico there were also some terrible results, you know, in 1968 in Mexico with adolescents rebelling. In France, in Czechoslovakia, it had a bizarre, you know, manifestation in China. So she said, well, it's not surprising that adolescents are rebelling because there's a lot of them and they've been stuck in the teen culture, and then they've been blamed because they're stuck in the teen culture. But then we stuck them there. And then they look at the world and see there are many, many parts of the world that don't work very well, or they're abusive, or there's injustice. And they point that out to adults, and adults will want to hear about it. So she said what we really needed to evolve into was a recognition that adolescents had a lot to offer adult society. But they could only offer it if we invited them into adult life. We took them out of the teen ghetto. We invited them into adult life. We had them engaged in real life, doing things in real life, using their gifts, and in appropriate ways. You know, I mean, you don't expect a 15-year-old necessarily to work a 40-hour week. And we're not talking about exploitation or abuse. We're talking about engagement. We're talking about contribution. We're talking about respect. And if you did that, then adolescents would be interested in the fact that old people have wisdom. Now, young people also have a gift, which is that they can often see things more clearly than old people because they don't have 30 or 40 or 50 years of experience and memories in their way. So there's a mutuality that's potential that Margaret Mead described, you know, beautifully in her last book, Culture and Commitment. And I'd encourage you to check that out. So that's my wrap about adolescence. We have this opportunity, which is, this is the future of the species. If we could actually, you know, I did a program once, we need to annihilate high school. That was the title, The Annihilation of High School. I had a big attendance at that one. And so anyway, I'll stop there. That's the gist of it. And I have a paper I'd be happy to share with people if they want to know more about it.
So Luke, we would love to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, my mom showed me what you wrote, David, and I found that really interesting to put it in perspective. The sort of change from it being a natural progression of taking on more responsibility and moving into the adult world. Then there was sort of this in-between state created, and there's a lot in my school. There's certainly a lot of people who come to their work and come to school, students and staff, with a lot of love and passion for what they do, and they really want to sort of impart their knowledge and skills, and also really support students in what they want to do. But there's this sort of the kind of, I feel like a lot of my friends and myself also can become sort of paralyzed by imposed fears that makes anything that would come from us naturally, and so the energy that we have, and what you were talking about, the sort of the vision of saying, hey, this is actually kind of messed up. Let's do something about it. There's no direct channel where that energy can go. It's sort of stifled by, oh, but I have to do this and I have to do this, and it's, yeah. So I guess if school, or an alternative to school, would be really an avenue where that energy could go into making a change, that would be, I think, the ideal for me. And that goes along with exploring your own passions and what you love doing and just having fun. I think they absolutely go together.
I agree with a lot of what you're just saying, Luke, especially about that last bit about pursuing your own passions. And David, there was a part where you were saying about adolescents learning from, taking things from their elders. And I think that is something, it's kind of a sore subject sometimes. Like, so you ever, like, parents will always say, well, when you're older, you'll look back and you'll say, oh, my mom was right, and it's not a myth. It happens. I'm 20 now, and I'm getting to that point where there are times where I realize I was in the wrong. But it is also really hard to want to learn from, the parents and grandparents and, other people around you, because a lot of their advice comes from a negative place, where it's not advice that's saying, all right, I hear you, and this is also my opinion, but it's, I hear you, I disagree with you, this is what you have to do instead, which I think probably it doesn't really go over very well, because then when you feel put down, you don't feel like you're learning anything.
Well, I think that comes from a fear that comes from a misunderstanding of adolescence. And, again, my experience, I have a couple of experiences in my life where I was engaged in learning communities with adolescents who, what I would say, had a great deal of freedom and responsibility and appropriate boundaries, because, everybody in life needs appropriate boundaries. And, that's why we have society. And I would say that, in that context, the adults were very conscious of not doing what you just described. And the adolescents were interested in what the adults had to say. But one of the things was that often the adults waited until they were asked, rather than volunteering. They waited because the nature of the culture in the learning community was voluntary to begin with. It was all voluntary, and that is really different. And I actually know some parents who can do that, who've done that. Obviously, it's harder if you're a parent because you love your child and you want to keep them from making mistakes. But in some sense, the larger wisdom is that if you don't make mistakes, you don't learn. And you don't, so it's difficult as a parent because sometimes you're coming from a fear place. But again, it's a matter of more and less, not all or nothing.
I want to bring back the community into this equation because that is where could save this barrier. Like, of course, I don't want to go and ask my parents for a thing when I have a doubt or something. Still now, and I'm almost 50 years old. But there's all other wise old people that I could come and ask for advice or direct learning from them. So I think that is what you were describing, David, seems to me like the reproduction of what society still is in indigenous communities all around the world. And but particularly more and more, I feel the people that are really engaged with learning, not with education, not with telling people what they need to learn and how they have to behave, but to be open source of knowledge for others to come and take from. More and more believe this idea that if I go and instruct, then I'm received, like you were saying, like this is what you need to do. But if I'm, instead of teaching, I'm open for people to learn from me, then it's not only is that relation that is created from the tutor to the learner becomes also in a friendship ties to create inside a classroom under the institutional
I have to agree. You said in the beginning when you spoke about, or maybe it was David, about Buckminster Fuller, that we should not be fixing the system, that we should be creating our own system. And I really believe that that is the only alternative at this point for 21st century learning. I don't think we're going to find what we want through the systems, through the schools. And I think there's so much resistance, too, to changing a system that is in place, that is intentionally in place to set up a system of control. So perhaps kids don't come out of the system empowered. They come out of the system as good citizens that work hard. And if we can decide as educators or facilitators or as parents or as human beings that are connected to this ecosystem that we're talking about, then these are the conversations we need to keep having, and these are the things that we need to keep doing. So yeah. And I just also want to point out that I know Gianna, because she's participated in 4 of our temporary learning communities for teenagers, where we set up communities that do just that. I'm not a teacher. I'm a co-facilitator, and I hold the space. And that's, I have the utmost respect for teens. And again, I'm going to use the word adolescence and feel, David, that it's like a false word, but I get it. And I think it's really important to set up spaces that empower kids and help inform their own autonomy.
Well, when the adults also, Gianna, when the adults learn from the adolescents, that also creates a dynamic of equality. And again, a quick example. I am in my 20s, I was 24, 25. I was a house parent to 26 African-American teenagers. I was the only house parent, fortunately. There were 3 of us. But I learned more in that year, maybe than any other year in my life, because I was in charge of getting them up and getting the meals and getting them to school and all that. But they created the culture in the house, and they taught me about it. I was the student, and it was great. I mean, I learned an enormous amount about African American culture and met some really wonderful people.
Regarding what you were talking about, the sort of learning from elders or learning from parents or teachers, and it being sort of an imposed instruction rather than being led by the learner's curiosity. Yeah, I think that links back to the practice, having a regular practice of listening, where the listening is mutual and focused, and whether that's around a specific question or just practicing being present to hear what's coming from the other person. And I think that works for that holds true for holds true both ways, for learning from elders and educators, and for for elders listening to the needs and interests and questions and ideas of younger people.
Definitely, I think that coming back to the question you start this show with, Lenny, maybe one of the most important skills that we need to learn is how to establish meaningful conversation, how to deep listen carefully to the other with respect, accepting the otherness of the other people, and knowing that it might not resound inside me the way it resounds inside the other, the same thing that we are hearing. So I will say listening and speaking with gentleness and compassion, as Bridget was saying before, is one of the most important skills for learning in this and any other century, probably.
Yes, Yeo, I read that you're also an art of hosting practitioner, and me too. I've done some trainings and I practice it. And one of the, I guess, slogans, Neil, you can say in art of hosting is, you become what you practice. And I think that's why the practice is such an important part of this. And we have practiced that at home. We actually have our small listening circle and a regular practice in mindfulness and in listening. And I think I heard from Luke that it's fairly rare in his peer group that it's so easy for him to talk with his parents. And that, coming back to the community and to schools, this is what I see is the structure of the schools are actually perpetuating the separation between students and parents. And I mean, I could see that in that very well-meant concept and innovative concept of that school, there was kind of that we treat you as the young adult as a respectful person, you know what you want and we help you to get there. And it was not nearly sort of like, but we don't want the parents there, you know, it's you, and we rescue you from this bad, suppressive, oppressive adult parents' world in a way. It's kind of like we liberate you. So there is that missing, again, that missing systemic working. So it's not, although there is sort of that euphemism of learning community, but it's not practiced. And so my observation in school communities is often, you know, even when there might be a concept or intention of being democratic, there are hidden hierarchies which are not acknowledged, which make it to an undemocratic system. And people are sort of like the hierarchy of the older have the say, and not the ones who come in new haven't got all the right to say, or they're sort of acknowledged, unacknowledged hierarchies, you know, in maybe in independent schools of they're the ones who own the philosophy and the ones who don't know the philosophy. I have seen not to be unkind or critical with these specific systems, but just looking from a systems point of view, I actually saw that people, parents are not confident enough to ask questions because they feel like I might be seen, I actually trust, that this philosophy will help my child. And so they don't trust their own relationship to the child and their own intuition with being with the child. And one last point is that I could also observe that parents often, in dealing with schools, repeat their own schooling, that they either conform and be the nice cake baking fundraising parent, or be the rebellion and fight the system and question everything, and there is no I have it's really what we have to practice, where we have to get this conversations going, is to actually create adult to adult conversation and partnering. But again, I agree with Lainey. I think and David, it's probably worse than in the military, the resistance. So I agree with creating new systems needs where it needs to go. John Gray wrote recently also, I read about these learning communities, and I think we all agree with this. That's where it needs to go. Yeah.
I agree with what you were saying about, specifically when you were talking about schools. You were saying that schools want kids to learn away from their parents, right? And that it's it's an oppressive situation to be always controlled by your parents. And I think that you really do need to have some sort of connection with your parents to learn. Like, it's really the best way to learn is to all be communicating in a household. But also, I think parents need to learn to let go at a certain point, because whether they want to or not, and no matter what your schooling situation is, if you're in public school or you're homeschooled or you're, whatever it is, I know I went through a period where really the best thing for me was to be learning from my peers and to be learning from my friends. And I think a lot of adolescents go through that, where it's best for them to branch away and to become their own person is to learn from other people. I learned from my friends' mistakes and they learned from mine, and it's just kind of feeling out what the people around you are learning as well, because what you learn from your parents you can bring to them and vice versa. So I think that's also an important part of learning as an adolescent, is respecting your elders, but also learning from each other, instead of always needing the reassurance and the help of somebody older than you. Yeah.
I think we need to learn how to learn from everyone and from everything around us. I just want to touch a little about these notions of hierarchy and the elders and having to learn from someone that is older from you. I think there's been a big transmogrification of that word. We now think that hierarchy means power, and so there's an illegitimacy behind the word hierarchy. I do think that there are moral hierarchies in society that are needed, and are needed to set what David was describing as healthy boundaries before that. The difference is, how do you achieve that hierarchy, right? And I think that in a process where everybody learns from everyone, then that hierarchy naturally start building, and you go and ask the guy that have more experience, not because he have or she had more power, but because I know that she probably know best. And so it's me. So the hierarchy is known from top to down, but from down to top. Hierarchy, you achieve hierarchy when the people recognize you in that position, not in the other way around, that more and more modern societies try to tell us like the hierarchy is the guy that have the biggest salary or the biggest gun. No, so that is also part of the shift we need to achieve, to put back learning as the joyful, creative, everyday activity in our lives instead of something that you have to go and achieve elsewhere outside of your life.
Going back to something David said early on and during the first hour, what is going to be that car crash scenario that is going to jolt us into making a change, right? And nobody's going to make a change on a wide systemic basis unless there's some wake-up call. The more that we just sort of float from one era to another, and whether it's 20th century to 21st century, yeah, there are changes, but what's going to be that thing that wakes us up, that really creates that need for change? And does anybody on the panel have any thoughts?
Oh, I think that the crash happened long ago. We are already in the post-crash era in education. And for me, like the best example for that is like the amount of debt people in the United States and other modern countries have because of their education. And then at the saddest part of it is that most of the people that are in debt for life because they went to school are making their living for something very different to what they studied at school and was supposedly to give them the skills and the ability to make the life they wanted. And I think that more and more projects like David's projects and other projects all around the world, I see popping out different alternatives and experiments of how to learn. And they are not all in the system, actually. Like, I think that more than ever, people start needing the passport of the degree to go into that. And the paradox on this is that most of these come because of the entrepreneur boom that happened. Now everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. The stupid thing is that we tell them, you have to innovate, but you have to do it the way I think it should be done and that I already know that works. No? But really I see people all around the world, especially young people, figuring out new ways of getting what they need outside of the system, because the system already kicked them out. Like, and so I feel that the crash is already here, that the emperor is naked, but we don't want to say it. No, but we prefer to look to another place. But those that have to suffer school systems are already walking out of them and creating their new alternatives, not very, very worried about if they are going to get a valid degree in a paper at the end or
not. If I were 30 years younger, I would tell you the answer. As I said before, I don't know. I think the hope that I have really comes from the theory that, you really only need maybe 10% of the population to have consciousness to really begin to transform the culture. That's, a figure cited by a number of cultural historians. And I also think, again, that it's clear that change in history is unpredictable, that it's not linear, that things happen in a non-linear way. And I also think that in many ways that the United States is not going to be the center of this evolution. I think the United States is in many ways the most reactionary society because we got the most goodies out of the the industrial peak period of the 20th century, and we're reluctant to give up our goodies. I mean, it's only as my generation ages out, as boomers age out, and people who grew up at a more difficult and challenging time come into positions of authority, I think that things will really begin to change. And that's going to happen. I'm a big advocate. I'd like to, this is sort of arbitrary, but I'm 68. I'd like to kick everybody over 60 out of governmental roles. I know you can't do that, but if I had a wand, I would say, let's hand it over. It's time, So since I'm not 30 years younger, I don't know the answer though.
I like that idea very, very much. I think it's a great idea.
Well, they have to come and take it. That's the thing. We're not going to, boomers aren't going to hand it over. So people have to come, and they are. And that's one of the things that's happening in right now, which is really exciting. People are younger people and young people are organizing and using the tools. We see that, again, I'll say one more thing. But these young people from Parkland, this is unprecedented what they've accomplished. They had this terrible, terrible experience. And instead of just sitting back and grieving, I'm sure they're grieving still, they said, we're going to do something about this. And they used the tools that they have. And this is really, I think, may well be a revolutionary moment in the sense of young people, really exerting power through social media.
Oh, I don't know, that my opinions on that whole situation are a little mixed, because I think a lot of, especially, the adolescents in the situation are taking this opportunity to pose, they're overreacting about the wrong things, especially with the shootings happening. I think it's bringing about a lot of interest in politics and gun laws, and adolescents the younger generation, they don't feel as strongly about the gun laws as the older generation does. And I think it's a barrier it's making it hard to talk about anything serious. I also think a lot of what we should be talking about is psychological, and not about where they get the means for where they get the guns, but what's going on in their heads. And I think the people that want to talk about that they're not really getting out there enough. And I feel like that's a problem that we're having on social media, especially not on news outlets, but just regular social media. I'm seeing nothing useful, that coming from places where normally you'd see younger generations speaking out about these things. It's very suppressed, I think.
Well, not to put all the burden on you, but maybe you're the one who needs to start that conversation. And again, I don't, I'm not there, so I'm not on social media very much. I don't know what's going on. I'm not 20, but I think one of the things, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I think what you're saying is absolutely true also. But I think one of the things that's really been interesting and amazing to me is the extent to which, they've led this campaign with integrity. Now, you may have wanted it to be more complex and deeper, and maybe, somebody else can lead it somewhere. But it's given the pressures, the pressure of going from being a student in a conventional upper middle class high school in Florida to being a spokesman on a national stage and having integrity. It's a pretty amazing achievement. I don't think I could have done it. My ego would have gone, it'll go out the window. You know, if I got a chance to talk to 300,000 people or be on network, I mean, you know, and maybe they are being distorted. I don't know, but in their public presentations, I think it's an amazing accomplishment that these young people have achieved to hold their integrity. And so I personally want to give them credit for that. But I do appreciate what you're saying. I think you're right, and maybe it could lead into that.
And I think maybe it's lots of little car crashes that are starting and initiating people having a voice. And I think maybe through all these, and I hate to use your analogy as little car crashes, but those are the small jolts that are giving people a voice that may lead to some sort of systemic change that we're talking about here. So
one other thing I'd say about this is that, you know, we have this history of glorifying particular adolescents who do extraordinary things. You know, I mean, you see that in the media. Well, this 12-year-old started a foundation that did this, or this 16-year-old wrote a symphony, or this 18-year-old. And, you know, again, going back to my original point, I don't think there's anything necessarily special about these young people from Parkland High School. I've been to Parkland. It's a fairly conventional upper middle class community. It is racially integrated. They have this 3,000 kid school, which is enormous. No wonder they have anonymity. And but I don't believe these are special people. You know, these young people. Emma Gonzalez, I don't believe that she's God's gift to America. I believe that this is a capacity that adolescents have that is called forth from them by the situation, by their grief, by their terror, by their opportunity. And what you see is this incredible, you know, capacity to engage people. Sorry if we're talking about things going on in the United States, and you know, it's not. My point is that it's not unique in these people. It exists, you know, I believe, out there in everyone. You know, if they're given the opportunity and allowed to be called forth, they do it in their own way. But people could do it.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I think that is the critique I understand Luke brought in. There is sort of that celebrity culture in this individualistic orientation, and that is exactly where we need to move away from if we talk about 21st century skills. You know, we need to overcome this to know that it's all of us. We need to find the collaborative skills, and like David says, it's all of us. It's normal. It's not special in a way, you know, just to make room for that. And I think, thank you, Lainey, that you actually providing that platform, because every conversation actually leads towards it. You know, every conversation we start around that is part of it. Thanks.
You're welcome. And these are not easy conversations to have because we don't have a roadmap, nor do we know where we're going to end up. But actually, what Luke was saying, having a forum where we can speak and listen to one another and actually share these ideas is super, super important. And I feel among young people, whether they're you know, under 12 or, you know, from an adolescent, you know, up to 25, I feel like their voices are not taken seriously. And when David spoke in the beginning about the democratic school process, right? I mean, yes, a young person has the same weight and power as, you know, an instructor. And I think those are really valid systems that can show an example of how we can practice that kind of empowerment. Yeah, and it's a shame. Again, it's a shame that a national tragedy is the only form that you know, allows a teen or an adolescent to be empowered to speak up. It doesn't always have to be a tragedy. I don't want to, you know, I don't want that to be the only solution. I want it to be empowerment for the sake of growth in humanity moving into 21st century. So yeah.
Well, we need to move the voting age to 15 or 14. That's a step.
I don't know if voting will be enough. What we need to do is to open those spaces for youth participation. Like if we want those young people to get empowered and to express their talents and their gift to the society, we need, I really love David's invitation, like take over, like let's make room for people to empower themselves. We talk all the time, we men talk all the time about women empowerment. We all adults talk all the time about youth empowerment, but we keep taking the center of the scene. So what I'm really glad of having Luke here in this show, and more I discover that when young people have the opportunity to explore and express their talents, they come with awesome things that surprise us all. I learn a lot with young people all the time, you know. So maybe that's what we need to do, is to open more spaces for youth, but seriously, like serious spaces. It's not like to make them their little thing on the side so they could feel included. No, really, like let's move out the center and see what happens when young people start driving and taking the wheel for driving the society.
And we just have like 15 minutes left, or a little bit less than 15 minutes left. I would like for each of our panelists to give some final thoughts. What did you discover that you didn't know, or what unfolded for you that changed from the beginning of the show to now as to what we really think that we need in terms of skills needed and education learning for the 21st century? Final thoughts. Yeah, why don't we just go around and everybody shares their final thoughts? And we'll start off with Gianna.
Well, I think, gosh, it's given me a lot to think about for sure. Because not that it's not something I think about often already. It's a big thing right now to be taking a hold of our education and trying to progress the way we learn and the way we interact with our community. And I think that it was really great to hear everybody's separate opinions. And, you know, whether we all agree or not, I mean, if we all agreed, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's good to hear everybody's varying opinions. And I think that having all the different ages as well is important. So I'm really glad that I got to really get a feel for what other people in different places and different in the world and in their lives think on the same subject.
Yeah, thank you. And who would like to go next? Okay.
Well, if nobody else wants to go. Well, let's see. First of all, I'm struck by your comments about the larger conversation that would be possible in relation to Parkland. That really gets me thinking about that. So thank you. And my colleagues on the panel, I've really just enjoyed your perspectives. I mean, we sort of essentially agree about a lot of things, and at the same time, each of us has our own life experience and our own perspective. And one of the things that I enjoy about this kind of conversation is just the particularity that each person brings, which is not mine. And so, Luke, what it requires is the kind of listening, that you described so well. So thank you all. Really interesting couple of hours.
So I just want to thank you again for the invitation. I really enjoy these shows a lot. And when I mean, I also enjoy it even more. And I just want to say that I'm really impressed of the level of engagement and participation of the youngest people, both of you in this conversation. I'm really thankful for your comments and your presence. I think that it always helps to refresh what you're thinking and contrast it with what is out there and I cannot see with my middle-aged eyes. And I am a terrible optimistic in this life, so like this only like reinforce my optimism that somehow we don't know how to get straight in the road again, but I'm sure that you and the next generations will, and I have all my faith put in that. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed being a part of it. It was very interesting, and thank you, Lainey, for organizing and creating the space for these conversations to happen. And yeah, one thing that I thought that we didn't talk about so much, it was touched on briefly, but was I think it was referred to as ecological consciousness or awareness of our interconnection with our planet, and that's one other thing that I think is at the core of what's needed for a sustainable and vibrant future. Is it's not really something you can teach, but you can hold the space where that can happen, and I guess that is connected to the dialogue as well. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope we can actually stay in conversation. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, also thanks for being here. I think what's next is what's already here, because that what we're just doing, I think I enjoyed it so much, and I think there's energy in it. And we often have that, I guess, attention on what's next and what's the future, that we're actually not realizing how great things we're actually doing already. So that we're actually here together. We are here together in this with slightly different perspectives, but also with something what actually I felt really connects us. We have, that I felt, yeah, there was something what connects us, the magic in the middle. And yeah, with the ecological consciousness, or this just bringing in what's at stake at this time. We looked at that video, and what was missing in that video was actually talking about in what times are we living. That was just really neglected. And I just want to quote Bayo. Bayo's a friend who was on that show before, Bayo Akamalava, who says, the times are urgent, let's slow down. And, to listen and to hear each other and to make sense of what's happening and to create meaning together, we really need to slow down. And that's often very difficult in these times where we think, with FOMO, fear of missing out. There's an Australian cartoonist who made a beautiful cartoon. I sent it to you. It's called JOMO, the joy of missing out. So it's a really nice cartoon. I'll send it later. And okay, thank you. I hope to see you. We stay in conversation, as Luke said.
Yeah, and I just want to say that, Luke, you did bring up the ecosystem of the future and the ecosystem of now. And I think these sorts of conversations are contributing to that ecosystem. And I think we're all part of it. And this is the 121st show that we've done. And sometimes the conversations are very heated and very poignant and very directed. And sometimes they just flow the way that they flow. But all of that energy goes into this movement. And I'm so grateful that every one of you participated in this conversation tonight. This has been so incredibly meaningful to me, and I thank you. And I thank my beautiful co-host who agreed to participate last minute. And I just, again, thank you all. Thank you. I've got so much gratitude for each one of you. I do want to remind our audience, if you'd like to find out more information about our panelists, please do go to the website to get their links and more information about their projects. If there are any other final words, David, you're
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. I also want to thank Nina, who produced this show. And of course, I always want to thank Mel and Biggie over at the Conscious Consumer Network. And we're just so grateful that you've provided this space for us over the last 3 years to host these conversations. And we hope that we've got a very healthy 3 more years in the future. So wherever you are and whatever you do, continue to always do it for the love of learning.
Humanity has been on an epic journey of discovery, learning the truth about the world we live in. New discoveries about the true origins of humanity, ancient history, free energy, as well as the systematic corruption of world governments are now on the forefront of our daily reality. Is the world headed towards destruction based on control and power? Or is an opportunity now being presented to shift and uplift into a higher consciousness? My name is Mel V, co-founder and creative director of Conscious Consumer Network, an independent broadcast network that was launched on the 1st of January 2015. In the last 3 years, Conscious Consumer Network has broadcast over 2,800 shows in multiple languages, featuring guests from across the world, whilst creating media that is aimed at the creation of a free, fair, peaceful, just, sustainable world. Conscious Consumer Network provides full training and an interactive support network for all broadcasters, and we are always looking for inspiring and educational content.
Hi, this is Lainey Liberty.
And this is Miro Siegel.
In 2018, Conscious Consumer Network has expanded to multiple broadcast locations, increasing our availability and reach across the world, remaining on the cutting edge of independent media. If we wish to create a better world, we must first create better media, geared towards real education instead of indoctrination.
You guys really are what changing the world is going to be about. It's educating kids at a grassroots level.
Having become a pillar of stability in the turbulent world of independent media, we have even more going on in 2018. Conscious Consumer Network is a publicly funded network, and we rely on all of you to keep us on the air. Show your support for independent media by donating to our 2018 Network Support Fund. Dare to seek a better world. Support independent media.